Yes, let me start. It is my enormous pleasure to introduce Professor Jessica Wang, Professor of US History at the University of British Columbia in Canada. This annual meeting of the History of Economics Society, which was originally planned and hoped to take place in person in Utrecht, but now unfortunately has to take place in this virtual space. Being the organizer of this conference, it gave me some privilege to have an influence on the choice of the keynote speakers. When we were organizing the first attempt of having this conference in Utrecht, now 2 years ago, it was already clear to me that I wished to have an inspiring as well as a challenging historian of science, who also would be of interest to this community of historians of economics. It is looking for a sheep with 5 legs, as we say in the Netherlands. And as the expression tells us, there will be not so many of them, if any. But actually, I have to admit, it did not take me that long. I had met Professor Wang at a few conferences in the field of history of economics, as well as history of science. Each time I was impressed by the way she's able to relate economics with science and with society, or to be more precise, to relate history of science and medicine with US political and intellectual history, with political theory, urban and social history, and the history of US foreign relations. In her work, these are not separated worlds, and her history shows the fruitfulness of studying them integrated. It makes one even wonder, particularly me, however can they have been studied separately? I will name the titles of her book to show her broad but integrated scholarship. Her most recent book is Mad Dogs and Other New Yorkers, Babies, Medicine and Society in an American Metropolis, 1840-1920, published by Johns Hopkins University Press 2 years ago. A special issue co-edited with John Krieg. It's called Nation, Knowledge and Imagined Futures, Science, Technology and Nation Building post-1945 in the journal History and Technology. And her older work, American Science in an Age of Anxiety, Scientists, Anti-Communism and the Cold War, published by University of North Carolina, 1999. Therefore, I was very happy to know that she accepted my invitation now 2 years ago, and also to accept it again when we were organizing our second attempt a half year ago. Well, this long period gave her at least some time to think, rethink and consider and reconsider the topic she would like to address to us. It has become agriculture, nature and economic knowledge, rural economy and the thinkers in the long 19th century. Jessica, with pleasure, I give you the floor.
Thank you, Marcel. Thank you very much for that generous introduction. I hope I can come close to living up to it. And I will thank those of you out there for coming. I can't actually see you, but Marcel tells me that you're out there. This is certainly not the way we wanted to hold this event. So I'm very sorry not to be in Utrecht, which is a city I've enjoyed visiting, but I'm glad to be here and to have the chance to present this work. And I think Marcel's comment about the search for sheep with 5 legs is extra appropriate given the topic of the presentation I want to give. So, as participants in this conference, I think know better than anyone, economy as a branch of knowledge has historically come in multiple guises, and the economics that emerged in its 20th century disciplinary form that's familiar to us today, it bears a relatively limited resemblance to the diverse forms of economy, whether domestic, political, moral, or otherwise, that animated discussions prior to the late 19th century. And my current research has been focusing on actually the history of agriculture, specifically on tropical agriculture and American insular empire in the early 20th century. So I've been thinking a lot about the history of agriculture in recent years. And as a result, what I want to do today is explore a rural economy in the 19th century as one of those offshoots of 19th century economy. And in doing so, I want to try and tease out from the rural economy literature some questions about what we might learn about the history of economics by engaging this literature. So rural economy in the 19th century, it encompassed anything from the science of soil to the full-blown political economy of agriculture. For example, in the 1840s, the American agricultural improver Henry Coleman, he published this 2-volume account of his travels in Europe and his reflections on rural economy. And the table of contents you see here, which is only partial, gives you a sense of just all the topics that rural economy encompassed. You know, it ran the gamut from practical matters of cultivation to the conditions of the laboring classes. So his treatise, which we'll return to in a little bit, you know, it looked at, you know, seeds and plants and crop varieties, livestock, farm implements, soil types and conditions, fertilizers, and other kinds of topics related to the actual process of cultivation. Anything from that to the institutions and educational bodies surrounding agriculture, to investigations of land tenure, the conditions of rural populations, the implications of the Corn Laws, a burning issue at the time, and the basic moral and political questions raised by wage labor and the immiseration of England's rural laboring classes, among other topics. Now, these kinds of subjects, such as the list of topics related to soil that you see here, they're actually not unfamiliar to historians of economics. I think people in the history of economics have long recognized the significance of, say, nature's economy, for example. Margaret Shabas, my UBC colleague, who I hope might be here today, she's certainly written a book on this topic that's probably familiar to all of you out there, that she's interrogated, for example, the linkages between the economy of nature and economic thought to show how ideas about geophysical and biological processes mixed and melded with conceptions of wealth, value, the movement of currency, and other basic economic phenomena. But where Margaret really sought to identify the resemblances and points of contact between the conceptual architectures of natural history and Enlightenment economic thought, I want to do something that I think is somewhat different here today. I really want to try and understand rural economy on its own terms. And in doing so, to try and explore what is really a pretty basic question, namely, what kind of economic knowledge might we find in 19th century discussions of rural economy? So to explore this question, I would like to highlight 3 episodes in the intellectual history of rural economy from the 1790s to the 1860s. So, and I apologize that the 19th century the long 19th century I had originally promised actually became a bit shorter in the end, but I didn't make it into the 20th century. But we have 3 episodes here from 1790 to 1865 that give us insights into this question about the economic nature of rural economy. So first of all, I want to look at the English agricultural writer Arthur Young and his American correspondence, and what it tells us about the strange habits of assigning value, calculating, and thinking in economic terms, that these habits seemed very strange to Americans in the 1790s. Secondly, I want to look at Henry Coleman's forays into the world of English agriculture in the 1840s, because this gives us an occasion to think about the market not in abstract terms. I think the market is usually thought of as this kind of abstract set of quantitatively measurable exchanges. But one has to remember also that markets were actually real places. And Coleman wrote extensively about one such place. And then finally, I want to close by looking at deforestation, and looking at deforestation not just as a problem of access to wood as a resource, but as a problem of sheer environmental catastrophe in the middle decades of the 19th century. And we can gain insights about all the things that deforestation meant by focusing on a couple of the writings of one writing of the French economist Jérôme Adolphe Blanqui, and the second work I want to focus on is by the American polymath George Perkins Marsh. So first of all, Arthur Young in America. So Young's place in the history of political economy might actually be familiar to some of you. In the late 19th century, he was the best known figure in the field of rural economy and its call for what at the time was known as agricultural improvement. And he's remembered by historians of agriculture today for his efforts to survey agricultural conditions and develop early agricultural statistics, particularly in a study he did of late imperial France just prior to the revolution. So by the 1780s, Young also sought to extend his studies to the United States. So he got in touch with an aspiring farmer and agricultural improver named George Washington, who I think is better known today as first president of the United States. And with Washington as an intermediary, Young was able to ask America's landed gentry about agricultural conditions in the United States. So he had a whole list of questions about land value, the price of farm commodities. He wanted to know about soil conditions. He wanted figures on rents and taxes, and he hoped also to get accounts of typical farms' annual income and expenses. But the answers that Young got, they indicated how his correspondents, even try to answer these questions, they had to develop new ways of thinking and new habits of calculation. So some of the questions he asked were familiar, and Americans were very, they were quick to describe, soil conditions. They could talk easily about yields based on practices like crop rotation or manuring. They could express their dismay over the widespread soil exhaustion that came from the fact of cheap land and high labor costs in the United States. But then there were other kinds of questions that challenged Young's correspondents to imagine their world differently and to engage in particular kinds of numerical measures with a kind of more business-like and economistic attitude. And, a lot of his respondents just pronounced that they were just more or less at a loss at these kinds of questions. For example, one writer from Maryland confessed the following: I was obliged to rely principally upon my own observations and conjectures, for as very few measure their fields or produce, it is mere guesswork. I wish my conjectures had a more certain foundation. And this was, this guy was not alone in relaying this kind of response. These questions were just very unusual and curious to people who received Young's inquiries. Young himself was just astonished by these kinds of responses, and he wrote to Washington in early 1793 as follows: Is it possible that the inhabitants of a great continent, not new settlers who live only to hunt, to eat, and to drink, can carry on farming and planting as a business and yet never calculate the profit they make by percentage on their capital? And yet this seems to be the case. Among the responses that Young published, it was really only Thomas Jefferson who took readily to these categories of calculation and capital investment that Young placed beforehand. But even Jefferson admitted that, he had never thought in this manner before. It had never occurred to him, whereas other writers responded that they were just completely flummoxed by what Young was asking them to do. So what this tells us is that this effort to develop a kind of empirical, statistically based understanding of rural economy in the US early republic, that this was just a really novel endeavor. And it required American gentlemen farmers to just reimagine their lives and activities in numerical terms. Now, some of the people replied to Young took up the challenge very eagerly, but others were more doubtful. One writer suggested that rather than seeking testimony about abstract numbers, what Young should do was he should make the trip to America, observe agricultural conditions with his own eyes, judge for himself, this person wrote, and if he did that, he was going to discover how in a society based on cheap land, this curious calculating impulse was simply not relevant in America. So here's what he wrote, this correspondent. Our farmers need not make nice calculations about percentage. Rather, and then he went on to show how, in America, life for the farmer was different. And he wrote, instead of calculating, he labors and enjoys. With such farming in Europe, farmers would starve, and yet here they live well. So as these rather mixed responses to Young's queries indicate, I mean, basic forms of economic data, forms of data that are really mundane today, they had not become normal, relevant, or self-evidently useful in the United States of the 1790s. In the early 1980s, the historian Patricia Klein Cohen, she actually documented the lack of arithmetic literacy in the United States prior to the 1820s and 30s. And she wrote a very nice book that explored how Americans learned to understand their own lives and prospects along with the broader social circumstances around them. They had to learn to understand these things through quantitative measures and through numerical calculations. So Young was working in an earlier time, and he sought information at a time when, even the most intellectually engaged farmer landowners, because he was in communication with the America's elite, such people did not live in a state of constant awareness of shifting commodity prices and land flows and land values and flows of income and expensive or returns on capital. That this kind of world of numerical facticity and calculation, it had barely begun to make sense at the tail end of the 18th century. Now, by the 1840s, those kinds of habits had become more widespread, but even so, Henry Coleman, who was a Unitarian minister and a committed agricultural improver from New England, he complained in 1804 that in contrast to the people he spoke to in England and Scotland, he said perhaps a majority of our farmers keep no accounts whatever, and many who keep accounts exhibit only imperfect and slovenly examples. Now, Coleman's lament about the poor bookkeeping practices of American farmers, this constituted just one small part of his wide-ranging and thoroughgoing exploration of rural economy based on his travels in Europe. So, as already noted, Coleman's 1840s treatise, it ranged far and wide across topics that spanned, from the most detailed scientific and technological considerations of agriculture to urgent matters of political economy and public policy. But here today, I'm just going to confine our examination to Coleman's discussion of agricultural markets and their workings, because I think this is a way to open up how historians think about, what we usually just refer to casually as the market. And here, I think the insights of the sociologist and anthropologist Marie-France Garcia-Parpay have been useful. She, back in the 80s, and she revised this more recently in 2007, I think. She wrote this account of the reorganization of the strawberry market at Fontaine-en-Salon in the late 1970s. And she emphasized that it was social processes and always contested configurations of power that undergirded a system of trade that in practice approximated a state of perfect competition. It's a fabulous essay. And, as she emphasizes at one point, she wrote the following, that the practices which constitute the market are not market practices. And I think this insight underscores the importance of thinking about how markets work in practice as places that facilitate the trade in things that are ultimately real things that exchange hands. And Henry Coleman in the 1840s, he also implicitly understood the centrality of organizational structures and social norms to the workings of exchange, particularly in his vivid and detailed description of the weekly cattle market in Smithfield, London. So I'm not really going to talk about sheep, 4- or 5-legged, but I do have cattle in this paper. And when it came to Smithfield, Coleman explored how the agreed upon rules and social mores of the cattle market, they created what he saw at least as smooth working forums of exchange. in which established norms and structures of social organization generated trustworthy transactions. And in particular, he emphasized the useful functions performed by middlemen, namely the salesmen at Smithfield who operated as farmers' on-site agents. And he argued that social conditions meant that these salesmen, they had to be honest because they had reputations to defend. And moreover, they performed useful work, that they possessed expertise that the farmers themselves lacked about the cattle market. And so Coleman observed the following: the state of the market, the current demand, the supply to be expected, together with the state of the dead meat market and what supplies of meat already killed are to be expected, are all matters to be taken into calculation. So Coleman certainly spoke the language of calculation and capital by this point, and he saw these salesmen as offering important functions along these lines. And now his discussion of the state of the market, it arguably began to elide the distinction between the real and physical livestock market and its abstracted counterpart of supply and demand. But his account also stressed just the importance of the salesman's expert eye as cattle were viewed and bought and sold. So the Smithfield market conducted transactions based on the amount of meat that a live animal was expected to yield. And there were sort of, there were different ways to make these estimates. There were various sets of rules and measurements and tables that in which you could do some calculations based on the dimensions of the animal and that thereby estimate post-slaughter meat yields. For example, there was one method from a Mr. Hilliard that Coleman recorded as follows: estimating the weight of a cubic inch of meat at 171 grains, then girth 7 feet 6 inches and length 5 feet 4 inches, gives 41,235 and 84 hundredths cubic inches, which multiplied by 171 gives 7,051,328 grains, equal to 125 stones, 7 pounds of 8 pounds to the stone. So that was one way to estimate the amount of meat that a given animal would yield. But keen-eyed salesmen, Coleman found, they didn't need these cumbersome and error-prone measures and calculations. That instead, all they had to do was look at a cow or an ox, and they achieved remarkable accuracy, that the expert eye frequently provided results that were superior to calculated estimates. So Coleman was able to collect 16 examples of oxen and cattle in which he was able to compare rule-based computations, estimates by salesmen, and the actual weight of the meat by the butcher. And the salesman beat out the computational measures by a margin of 8-5, with 3 instances in which computation and skilled eyeball estimates reached the same result. Now, whether or not Coleman's description of how the cattle market worked was accurate, I don't actually know. I think we would need to do a lot of serious social history here, or perhaps someone has already written this social history and we just need to find it. So, whether or not the cattle market actually worked this way and so smoothly is, I think, to me at this point unclear, but that matters less for my discussion here than simply what his observations tell us about how this American observer tried to understand the workings of trade in practice. So in Coleman's eyes, at least, the market and its social practice, what it did, it accomplished an amazing feat. It transformed, the chaos of terrified cattle and strenuous efforts to drive them into place on the eve before the market opened. It transformed all of that chaos into orderly exchange the next day. So on the actual day that the market opened, Coleman observed, the immense business is transacted with a dispatch and efficiency and precision, which are quite remarkable. So in the physical space of the market, it was a blend of human and animal energy, social organization, and techniques for producing trust that turned the chaos of countless human and non-human interactions into what Coleman saw as the efficiency and precision of exchange. Then finally, we come to the third topic I wanted to address today, which is mid-19th century reckonings with deforestation. These reckonings brought together the intricate interplay between ecology and economy, and they give us another case for trying to contemplate the economic dimensions of rural economy. So here I think I've taken inspiration in particular from William Cronin's classic work, Nature's Metropolis. And I think one of the basic messages of Nature's Metropolis was simply that there's no economy without the ecology that undergirds it. So George Perkins Marsh's groundbreaking 1864 treatise, Man and Nature, or Physical Geography as Modified by Human Action, along with the work of Jérôme Adolphe Blanqui and other writers whom Marsh drew upon, they give us an opportunity here to address the intricate and overlapping relationships between nature and economy, and how ongoing anxieties about deforestation brought together discussions about disaster-prone landscapes, the natural and resource-based economies of woodlands, and the potential role of the state and public policy for mitigating the horrific consequences of deforestation. So there was a long established tradition of natural history observation from the early modern period onwards that made deforestation into really a kind of constant preoccupation of European colonial officialdom. And the late Richard Grove, the historian, he wrote magnificent work about early modern ruminations and worries about deforestation. But Marsh was one of the earliest writers to deal systematically and in a really big synthetic way with the ways in which human activities reshaped both climate and environment. And in the case of forests, Man and Nature provided a lavish account of how deforestation deprived locales of forest moderating effects on temperature and aridity. Deforestation destroyed the capacity of soil to hold moisture. And it had the end result of just unleashing torrential floods that threatened soil fertility with mass erosion events, in addition to otherwise perpetuating human death and misery and economic losses. Now, Marsh drew upon multiple sources in making his case about deforestation, and those sources included Blanqui's on the deforestation of mountains. This was a report delivered to the Academy of Moral and Political Sciences in Paris in 1843. Now, Blanqui himself, he was a protege of Jean-Baptiste Say, and he was a devotee himself of liberal economics. So he might actually be familiar to some of you. Certainly the world in which he lived is one that you're familiar, although maybe his particular concern here with declining environmental conditions in the French Alps, though, was perhaps different from his other concerns with political economy. But, as works of rural economy, Blanqui's and also Marsh's reflections on deforestation, what they give us are parallel meditations on anthropogenically induced disasters, the myriad concerns of forest economy, and the implications of forest management for national development. So Blanqui's account of the French Alps, it offered vivid testimony of just a bleak, hard-scrabble existence in a region defined by grinding poverty, challenging terrain, and ever-present environmental threats in four départements, Isère, the Upper Alps, the Lower Alps, and Var. And these were places so remote that inhabitants, and this was a kind of problem for the French nation, they hardly recognized their ties to the metropole. And so Blanqui's report, first of all, it just outlined the grim conditions that came with challenging mountain terrain and what he labeled the ravages of torrential floods. And these floods were made worse by deforestation. Since sheep have come up today, they were also made worse, he thought, by overgrazing. And these soil erasing events, what they signified, he wrote, was the increasing loss of agricultural capital. And moreover, though, they signaled, as he put it, and his language was very powerful, the earth itself, each day carried away by the water in a frightening progression. And so deforestation, siltation, and torrents, what they meant was wholesale environmental catastrophe that, silt filled in existing riverbeds, that further exacerbated flooding. And as a result, Blanqui wrote, disasters multiply in geometric progression as the hills are cleared. Now, this in the 1840s, this was also an era of French incursions into North Africa. So Blanc's account of deforestation, it also resonated with anxieties about deforestation, desiccation, and the horrific implications of denuded landscape in France that threw French nationhood itself into question and raised in his mind and the minds of others disturbing parallels between the space of the nation and the spaces that the French sought to colonize. So throughout his report, Blanqui compared scenes of poverty in the French Alps and the region's isolation from the rest of the nation. He compared these directly with problems of empire. For example, in labeling the Upper Alps and Arabia Petraea, that is the Arabian province of the Roman Empire, Blanqui was raising the specter of Rome's fallen empire, and he imported the imagery of the colony into the space of the nation state at a time when the French identity of people far outside the Parisian metropole, that was very much still in question throughout the 19th century. So from Blanqui's standpoint, the region's poverty meant that only the state could undertake a developmental mission for the Alps by undertaking a program of reforestation and improved infrastructure. And this was a program he described as an economic regime. So this was terminology that I would suggest merged nature's economy with pragmatic matters of budgeting and also with a vision of governance in which for Blanqui, it was only the state that possessed the resources and expertise and authority to oversee reforestation, landscape management, and flood prevention. Well, in Man and Nature, Marsh constructed a similarly devastating portrait of how deforestation just created scenes of environmental ruin. But Marsh's account tacked back and forth between an instinct for large-scale geophysical and biogeographical analysis on the one hand, with, on the other hand, his own description of his treatise as a set of inquiries that were, as he put it, purely economical. So then the question is, well, what did Marsh mean by the phrase purely economical? The protean quality of the economy of nature, at one level potentially made every characteristic of the forest and its properties as a living system that, operated through inputs and outputs of energy and matter, that those processes at one level were by their nature questions of economy in the 19th century sense. But Marsh also sought as a pragmatic issue to analyze the forest as a source of tradable resources exchanged in a cash nexus, in which incentives of profit from the extraction of lumber clashed with other human interests in healthy forest, especially stable soil structures and climatic moderation. So with this agenda in mind, Marsh showed how various cultural logics that they militated in favor of land clearing and extraction of labor over the prioritization of woodland's other economic functions. And he noted that under certain kinds of conditions, he wrote, the market price of timber, like that of all other commodities, may be said in a general way to be regulated by the laws of demand and supply, but it is also controlled by those seemingly unrelated accidents which so often disappoint the calculations of political economists in other branches of commerce. And so in making this statement, he also pointed to specific examples in which sort of the logic of the market had perverse results. And one of those problems, for example, is just simply short human lifetimes fed Americans quickness to sacrifice forests for their own short-term gains without regard for future generations. I see there's a hand raised. I don't know, maybe we'll hold off for a little bit unless it's really urgent. I can't see the question actually. So unless Marcel wants to stop me and weigh in. But anyway,
It is what you, sorry, it is what you want to have it, perhaps at the end.
And okay, then, yeah, why don't we wait?
Yeah, yeah.
That's fine. But thanks for the question. For Marsh, since unrestrained human need and human greed could not sustain forests' multiple economic functions, public policy offered the only solution. So like Blanqui, although I think far more reluctantly than Blanqui, Marsh concluded that forests needed public regulation. And again, he positioned himself as a pragmatist. As he outlined what he called the economy of the forest, he observed the following: that the sooner a natural wood is brought into the state of an artificially regulated one, the better it is for all multiplied interests which depend on the wise administration of this branch of public economy. So ultimately for Marsh, what the purely economical meant was a rationale for human stewardship of forests that excluded sentimentality, even as his own instincts for moral economy bristled against those kinds of constraints. For example, when he commented on the economic and ecological feasibility of managed stands of fruit and oil-bearing trees, he noted with regret, though, that even though such tree stands would protect the soil and provide economic benefit, they provided only what he called labeled a partial compensation for the loss of the native forest. So although the managed forest was better than no forest at all, in the end, the purely economical risked excluding the very properties of the forest that Marsh found most valuable. So to conclude here, in the end, what, if anything, do these episodes from the history of rural economy mean for the history of economics? I think those of you out there are better positioned to derive meanings for the history of economics from 19th century rural economy than I am. So, I'm looking forward to hearing not just today, but in the future, what this community might make of the rural economy literature. But what I hope I've done at least is to indicate some useful starting points in the habits of numeracy that came with Arthur Young's inquiries, or in the significance of the market as a real physical place for mediating tangible exchanges of goods, as in Henry Coleman's account of the Smithfield cattle market. And certainly in today's pandemic era world of shaky supply chains and global markets that move goods with anything other than frictionless liquidity, the infrastructural basis of exchange perhaps deserves greater attention. And then finally, can histories of deforestation, erosion, and flooding be made into histories of economic knowledge? I mean, the writers in the 19th century rural economy tradition certainly considered natural history and political economy as of a piece, as opposed to the ever-mounting forms of specialization that categorized the 20th century organization of knowledge. But in our contemporary age of rapid and increasingly damaging anthropogenic climate change, maybe as historians, we should kind of consider more lumping and less splitting in our conceptions of knowledge. And so with that in mind, is it even possible to imagine a 21st century economics dependent on more than, regimes of calculation and ever more sophisticated modeling, and the reduction of the environment and its management to a system of, tax credits, carbon credits, and other like-minded schemes? And there is scholarship from a variety of other perspectives, from environmental studies, what's called TEK, traditional ecological knowledge or traditional indigenous knowledge, or studies of the non-human, that they've placed growing emphasis on what is clumsily called relationality. But what this kind of scholarship does is it highlights the ways in which sustainable food systems and less damaging economic systems that, the argument is that they require reassessment of the human nature dynamic and other dualisms that facilitate extraction without consequences, as if nature and its bounty were infinite. So proposed solutions to anthropogenic climate change that continue to relieve people of the responsibility of, understanding their position within ecosystems and from understanding the physical and biological processes that sustain soil, agriculture, and other systems required to maintain life. Those being relieved of those forms of responsibility just may not be viable in the long run. And if that's so, the economy of Blanqui and Marsh arguably did a better job of recognizing the basic material realities of the intertwined economies of nature, morality, politics, and exchange than did their neoclassical successors in the 20th century. And so perhaps it would be helpful to look back if we want a livable economics for the future. And with that in mind, I want to leave Henry Coleman with the last word, because he noted that the dead meat market at Newgate had actually once been a college. And his comment on that fact, I think, deserves the final word. So he wrote the following: But alas, what would become of science, philosophy, eloquence, or even poetry itself without mutton, pork, and beef? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jessica. Usually you hear applause, but just imagine that that applause is there. I have a question, and it can work as follows. I can give the first hand. I can allow people to speak, and so Ronnie Hirsch, you can. I give you now the possibility to speak and ask your question. Ronnie? Oh, I didn't have one. Oh, sorry. The hand is taken mistakenly. That's okay. Okay. Oh, now I have to see switching things. Let me. Sorry, I have to adapt the situation.
I see that Mary Morgan just raised a hand.
How can you see that? Okay.
I saw it very briefly and then it disappeared.
Okay. 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 Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Now I see Mary. So I can give Mary the opportunity to speak. Mary.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. Great lecture. Thank you, Jessica. I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed it partly because I've done some work on, for a while taught American economic history. So I got a bit involved in thinking about American economics in the 19th century, particularly rather than the 18th. So I had one question and one observation. It seems to me that actually they're just a bit later than your period, you have this incredible example of the USDA's Bureau of Agricultural Economics, and the resources for that are absolutely amazing. I spent some time in their library and the land grant colleges, and their approach to agricultural economics is so broad and so embracing. I think it's really symptomatic of something which is different in the US conception of agriculture and the commitment or the sense in which agriculture has always been so important and still is important in the kind of general trade system compared to perhaps, you know, it's what happened to it in Europe. So I think that's, you know, that whatever the next part of your story is going to be great because that is such a wonderful resource. But my question was about the responses to Young, whom I'd also looked a little bit about his work in Scotland, I think it is. And I was wondering about the difference between if he was writing to people in both the North and the Southern states, and whether there was a very different kind of response from those in the North, individual farmers presumably, versus those in the plantation South. Because I could imagine that you, with the plantation system, you might have overseers who were calculators relative to the North, which are, you know, sort of single agents, if you like. So that was my question about that period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in response to the question, I mean, his correspondence were mainly from, I'd say, New York, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. But of course, some of the people from Virginia, such as Jefferson and Washington, they were slave owners and slave holders. And so, you know, but I don't find that there's that much of a difference in terms of the sort of ability to calculate or the abilities to sort of embrace habits of calculation. What I noticed in reading the correspondence is just the reticence about slavery and labor costs. You know, the conventional wisdom that comes out of the correspondence, and I'm sure you know this, and I was taught this in grad school, was the difference between the US and England is that in America, land is cheap and labor is dear. But, you know, where the silences mostly come in, though, are how do you calculate the value of labor of people who are enslaved? And that was something that, you know, it seemed to me that Washington was trying to duck that discussion. Jefferson was the one person who was willing to kind of take it on and view enslaved labor as something that he was invested in. But yeah, I don't think, plantations were run with, with enslaved labor were run with greater efficiency and calculation necessarily. But you're right, there might be a difference depending on, whether you're talking to the people who directly run the operation versus the landowners. Because I do know historians have commented that the sort of self-defined agricultural improvers were themselves not the people by and large who were working land with their hands. They were landowners who placed the actual functions of farming in the hands of others.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for the comment about the USDA and the Bureau of Agriculture Economics. And, maybe one of the issues also just has to do with the extent to which, agriculture and other forms of economic endeavor, they're kind of, these are separate discussions in it, as I understand it, although I hesitate to say these things because I know people will correct me. But they seem to me as somewhat separate discussions in the history of economics. And at least among historians of business and economic history and capitalism, it's sort of the industrial has often gotten more attention than the agricultural.
I'm sure you're right.
Okay, then I have questions in the chat box, but it's better that the person herself can raise the question. So the first one I have is Ariane Dupont. If I allow you to talk, so you can ask your question directly to Jessica. Ariane?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you very much for this great presentation. And I agree with your conclusion that we need to elaborate more between the different histories of science and history of economics. And I was thinking of the book of Caroline Marchant, The Death of Nature, 1980. And she has not proved that, but I like the idea, and we can see in your presentation how she relates the development of modern science, especially with the mechanics as power and the different ontological and epistemological assumptions related to that, to the development of environmental economics. She doesn't do as you have done so nightly and precisely, but I think there is a clue, and I would like to thank you for this presentation. And what do you think about Caroline Marchant approach? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think, this is kind of the question of environmental history and environmental studies, and the question of how to deal with, environmental catastrophe as a sort of as the problem of our age. And so, Marchant comes out of that year of scholarship that, from the 1970s and 80s, that was kind of suggesting all the ways in which, modern science was a value-laden project that, in one way or another involved a kind of domination of nature. And, and I think historians have kind of debated ever since whether that's somehow inherent to science or if it's part of just the structures surrounding the structures and ways of being that are sort of more generally distributed throughout society and this just sort of the way of life that we live. But the fundamental question then is, what do solutions require? And this is the ongoing debate about whether or not market-based solutions as they're conceived of today are sufficient to address the problem of environmental damage. And, honestly, I don't know the answer to that. Like, if carbon credits and trading them will work, I'd be perfectly happy if they did work. But I guess, in the kind of literature I've been reading, I'm increasingly sort of skeptical just about the possibility that it's good for human beings to live as if they don't need to know about the natural systems they're connected to. So, I've actually been taking introductory geoscience this semester. and just, learning just about the qualities of soil and what it's made of, and, and the kind of living matter that's a part of what makes soil fertile. You think about the world differently if you know these things. But, most of us don't farm. I certainly don't. We don't have a feel for any of this. Even people who did farm in 18th century America, it was cheaper to use up the soil and move on than it was to take good care of it. And lots of agriculture improvers kind of lamented this fact. But it's sort of, yeah, I'm skeptical that markets alone can really do the job. But that's a personal kind of skepticism. What the actual answer is, I think, remains to be seen.
I agree. What I like in Merchant is how she shows the way we define and the new science try to understand nature, farming or gardening. Mary Morgan loves gardening, for example. But the tools of the analytical tools to understand nature can be replicated in economics, and there is a dialogue between them that can explain that we do not have a good understanding. Just to conclude on what you were saying, right. I'm not sure that market can solve in that kind of framework, of course.
Yeah, I suspect there's a dialogue between ecology and economy that, it needs to kind of dig deeper, almost in a literal way, right? It needs to dig deeper into the actual processes at work by which, things grow.
Thank you.
We could talk about the history of guano, but I won't go there.
We have the next question is from Erwin Collier. I have, yes, this here. Okay, Erwin, you can ask your question yourself directly to the keynote speaker.
Am I unmuted now?
Yes.
Oh, wonderful. First, many thanks for the lecture. And as a card-carrying economist in the history of economic society, I'd be interested in hearing what the reception was of Johann Heinrich von Thünen, who, at least within theoretical and empirical agricultural economics of the 19th century, is really in the pantheon. So that was sort of the first question. I don't recall hearing him mentioned, but I mean, that was not the subject, but have you come up with serious readings of him at the time? And also, there was a very long administrative tradition within Germany on the management of public forests, as far as, the optimal time to cut trees, seen as a capital stock. And so the same sort of question, German forestry was highly developed as one of the administrative sciences. So that's where I'll just leave that. And again, thank you for your talk.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And I will say, this talk for me is very much a preliminary exploration. So, I will have sort of, I think you've given me more questions, you've given me great questions. I don't have great answers for them. I do think, so Marsh was widely read in the forestry literature. So, he knew German trends. He also knew the sort of histories in England and France of sort of protected royal forests and what happened in France after the revolution. So, in that sense, I think some of his notions of the managed forest and its potential comes out of that possibility. And it certainly comes from the sense that, forests, they just, they could not just be left alone, that they needed to come under regulation. But, in Marsh, as I was saying, I kind of sense that ambivalence, though, because I think he's somebody who, he's trying to argue in pragmatic terms, but he misses the fact of old growth native forest, which is not coming back for hundreds of years once it's gone. And so the German managed forest, it can give you, it can give you forests that will protect the watersheds. It can give you forests that are economically sustainable, which are great things in a context in which, there are parts of Europe that like people didn't have wood to heat their homes. I mean, this is why people are cutting down forests in the French Alps, as Blanchards describes. It's because these are regions that are incredibly poor and desperate for resources. They don't have a lot of infrastructure or money to get things brought in from outside. And so, people are desperate. That's why there's deforestation. So, managed forests can give you that level of livability. I think that is Marsh's hope. But the problem is they can't give you, they can't give you the restoration of virgin forest. And I think that's the lament. Von Thunen hasn't come up in my reading other than Cronin's account of him, so I unfortunately can't speak to Von Thunen. Yeah, what's interesting with Coleman is that he mentions very few other thinkers in political economy. The one person, I was telling a colleague about what I was reading in Coleman, and he asked me, well, who else does he talk about? Does he talk about Adam Smith, for example? The only person he mentions by name is Malthus. So that kind of, when Coleman writes about the immiseration of the laboring classes, it is that sort of Malthusian problem of overpopulation, that supposed overpopulation that that Coleman, as a Unitarian minister, he just comes out and says, look, who are you going to tell that they don't have the right to be born? The real issue is that we need systems of labor that provide enough remuneration for people to live decently. I see Mary has a comment, maybe, and Ariane has also spoken on Von Thunen. And yeah, I think the sort of spatial story about Von Thunen is what I know as well from Cronin.
I see whether, Mary, can you speak again? Is it possible? Or?
Yeah, sorry, no, the signing here is a bit confusing as to whether my hand is raised or not. So I didn't actually have a comment, but I do think Von Thunen is I think that's an interesting observation that he hasn't come up, because I think it's not part of necessarily seen as being the same mainstream as in political economy. So that doesn't surprise me at all. But I think the German link is potentially very interesting that Owen's raised.
Thank you. I have a question from Margaret Chabis. Margaret?
Yes, I think I can be heard now. Yes?
Yeah.
Yes, of course, I witnessed your talk for the world. And just so people know, we actually are in different departments, so our paths don't cross often enough. But we did have lunch in the last few weeks, and that was very pleasant to get together again. So one of the things I found reading István Hont again is that he emphasizes that it isn't really till the early 18th century with people like Henry Martin and others that you get a clear distinction between the components that form a price, the wage and the profit in particular, but as Adam Smith will also emphasize, the return to rent as this kind of adding up process in rent and price formation. So one of the things I really liked about your study of Young was his surprise that the American gentleman farmers had little attention to the profit per se. And that's something I think István Hont really helped emphasize, that it wasn't obvious to people in even the 17th century in places like Britain or France, that there really is this distinction to the wage and to the profit, that those two kind of had to be separated more distinctly. And you can think of Ricardo still having to emphasize the distinction between the capital invested on the land and the profit that is due versus the rent. And so these kind of clarifications are still very much, you might say, preliminary or in a jeune stage. And I think that your finding with Young is just testament to that it is not self-evident to people that there's this payment to wage and this payment to rent and this payment to profit, especially if you're in a situation such as North America, where land tenancy was quite different than Europe. You don't have the absentee landlords. You don't have the capitalist farmer of the physiocrats per se. You may, but so there's going to be a kind of very different set of understandings that strike us as peculiar, but I think make a lot of sense. So I really appreciated that. And I do think you did help bring out the ecological underpinnings of the economy. So I think that your work doesn't necessarily can clash with what I had tried to do in the earlier period. But thank you for that wonderful lecture.
Oh, well, thank you very much for your thoughts about it. And I think what strikes me about the response to Jan is that, you know, all of the sort of conceptual architecture and its emergence that you just outlined in your comments, Margaret, it's not just a clarification, but I think, you know, I think what the Jan story kind of underscores is that these are world-making acts, that people learn to understand what they're doing and who they are differently as they adopt these ways of seeing the world. I mean, it's kind of that question, these sort of economic relations, they sort of pre-exist and people are discovering them, or are people sort of reinventing the world based on the conceptual architecture they develop? I mean, I think that to me is the kind of the question here.
Thank you. We're nearing the end, and we are at the end of this very nice hour. Jessica, thank you very much for your talk. I find it very interesting. And if you asked at the beginning, well, I'm not sure about what my expectations were, whether they would be met yesterday. Certainly that what you showed us today is again that these things cannot be studied separately, and I thank you for that. So yes, it's a little bit an uneasy situation to end up, or normally I would take you for a glass of wine, but though it is early for you, but here it would be fine. But next time we're gonna have a drink together, and thank you very much for your keynote.
Well, I will raise my mug of coffee to you and look forward to that occasion and to happier times. So thank you very much. And thank you everyone for coming and for all of your comments.